afternoon in Europe. I couldn't see where everybody was from because they were coming in so fast. They scroll off the screen, but I think I did see Switzerland. I'm sure we have other people from Europe as well. We also have 28 new people that will be here today that were not here in the other 2 days. So just to remind everybody about what we're doing, between the 30 minutes after the hour and the hour, we do play vendor videos in the morning. And we will be playing them 2 more times today. At the top of the hour, I'm going to, well, very soon, I should say, I'm going to be introducing Dean Smith, who was our moderator for the day. And Dean will be introducing our morning speaker, Todd Conklin. I am very glad to see Todd's face. I was a little nervous about 15 minutes ago because Todd's face wasn't here yet. But thank you for being here, Todd, bright and early. What is it, 10 o'clock? It's 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock your time, I guess? So thanks for being here. I do want to introduce Dean Smith. I'm going to share my screen for a minute. Just a little bit about Dean. So we had to cancel because of COVID the live conference in that was going to be in Portsmouth, Virginia, and we had to cancel that in March. And very shortly after we canceled it and sent the message out that it was canceled, Dean Smith got in touch with me and volunteered to help us put this virtual conference on. This would not be occurring if it wasn't for Dean and some support people, of course. Dean helped us put out some surveys to see what everybody wanted. We had several focus groups to hear, and to dialogue with people about this. We actually even had some practice webinar kind of things just to make sure Zoom worked correctly and we knew how to do breakouts. And all of that led us up to this week. Day 1 and 2 were actually marvelous. People are really enjoying this, especially the breakout sessions, so that they can talk about what they heard during the talks. But Dean Smith, I don't know how to even introduce Dean, because I don't know if there's anything he can't do. He does what we're doing here. He's a marvelous person. He's the easiest guy I've ever worked with. He's just incredible. His email address is on the screen. Please take a picture of it, write it down. It's very appropriate, one in front at gmail.com, and he's going to be in front of you today. I shouldn't say that, but he's going to be the moderator for today. And Dean, it's been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure working with you this week. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dean. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Bob, thank you very much for the kind words. And it is a total pleasure and honor to be working with everybody to make this conference work and to see everybody that's joining us today. And it's been with us for the first couple of days. So welcome to day 3 of the HPRCT virtual conference. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes with some logistics and then I'll introduce Todd. For those of you that were with us on either or both of day 1 and day 2, we'll follow the same sort of cadence. For those of you that are just joining us today, what that really is in the morning and the afternoon sessions, we spend the first 45 minutes with presentation, and we wrap up our first hour with about 15 minutes of Q&A. Ideally, you'll be raising your hands or unmuting yourself, and we can get into a good dialogue after the presentations and really focus this on what you want to take away as learning and insight from the presentations. So after the presentation and the Q&A, we take a short break, typically about half an hour, and then we pick back up with a couple of focus groups to really fine-tune the the details and the specificity of what you're taking away and your insights and your aha moments, and really how you want to put those into practice in your organization. So that's the flow over the course of the time we have in both the morning session and in the afternoon session. Also at 1:30 US Eastern time, we have an optional set of focus groups. So the content for the afternoon, the presentation starts at 2 p.m. US Eastern. And at 1:30, if you want to come back and join an optional focus group, breakout group, we'll just create 2 big breakout groups where you have an opportunity to network or talk about specific areas of HP, RCT, in those different domains that maybe you need support or you have questions about. So they're just free-form optional things. So that's how it'll go. When we get into the breakout groups, I'll give you some more specific details on how those work and expectations and outcomes and timing. But for now, it is my pleasure to introduce Todd Conklin. So Todd is a senior advisor for organizational and safety culture at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And Todd's going to be talking about bouncing forward, which I think is going to be very interesting in many, many respects. And Todd, I think you're going to just guide us through some great insight and detail as we go over the next 45 minutes or so. So Todd, take it away.
Thanks, Dean. It is so sweet. And I think Bob might have a man crush on you. I want to get that out there so we can deal with it earlier. So HPRCT, it is such a treat to get to be with you guys. I have been looking forward to this little presentation for a while because of all the presentations and stuff that I get to give, there are few groups I can actually say this to. But your entire identity, as long as I've known you guys, and even before I've known you guys, has been about building resilience and capacity in a system. And we have just gone through, well, I don't even think we're through it. We're in the midst of 8 months of a test in how important capacity and resilience has become. And one of the premises I want to talk to you guys about today is the idea that we're moving from a world that has traditionally optimized efficiency. And all of you know exactly what I mean when I say that. Your organizations, the companies, the places that you work for, the people you work with, the organizations that you work around have really built systems that have wanted to create efficiency, create shareholder value, create higher profits, better, faster, cheaper. You know the drill, right? And now you're in a world that really has changed. And it's a world that's now optimizing resilience. And so suddenly you guys, and we all share this, the conversations we've been having for years, I mean, beating our head against the wall conversations we've been having for years about building resilience and understanding how systems work, those conversations are now remarkably important and remarkably poignant, if I can use that word at HPRCT. Can I use poignant? Is poignant okay? Is that in our vocabulary? And so this is a really, thanks. This is a really interesting time to do the work we do. And I think it's an exciting time. But I think to get into our conversation, I want to model a couple things for you because I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the direction in which we move. And to do that, I want to start with a really quick whiteboard case study. And I want you to watch this case study because it kind of sets the tone for this idea of bouncing forward. So we're not going to bounce back. I'm not sure where back is. I'm not even sure what normal means right now. We're in a world that's constantly changing, filled with complexities, lots of variability and lots of adaption. And what's cool about this is that's exactly the world we were in before the pandemic, before the economic crisis, before the social justice crisis, before amoebas that eat your brain, killer wasps, forest fires, heat waves. It's been a pretty sucky 2020. So let's kind of pull into that by looking at this initial case study and seeing what exactly happens. So hold on, and we'll come right back and talk about it after we get out of here. So this event takes place in a temporary loading platform for offshore support for natural gas wells in the Gulf of Thailand. And it was very temporary. It was set up on the beach, and they dredged the beach so it was deep and steep, and they could bring vessels in alongside where they had a construction crane on some concrete pads. And they would load 3 vessels a day, pretty much 6 days a week. And they loaded every single load on every single vessel with something they call super sacks, big bags, 1-ton cloth bags. Now, these 1-ton cloth bags are normally used for bulk items, granulated items like sand or dirt. But in this case, these guys would load everything into these big bags, these super sacks, and then they would rig those super sacks onto the crane hook. Boxes of equipment, maintenance items, food, probably people, but they said they never put people in there. Every single load, 3 loads a day, 6 days a week, was loaded into super sacks. The super sacks were rigged to the crane, and then they were taken through an exclusion area to the vessel to be unloaded on board the boat. If you load 3 loads a day, 6 days a week for 8 years, and everything's in super sack, what you are is the world's best expert in loading super sacks. But what you don't know how to do is load anything that wouldn't fit into a super sack. And that's where this story takes a turn. Because for the event, this crew was asked to load an inline gas separation unit. It's basically a piece of equipment that's in a piece of pipe. It's long, skinny, and heavy. If you look up in the dictionary things that won't fit in a bag, the definition starts with long, skinny, and heavy. And so these workers were faced with a condition that was off normal and they had not faced before. They had to solve the problem. And so what they did was adapt. So instead of using the super sack like a bag, they decided that they could use that same super sack like a sling. So they found the middle of the piece of pipe, and the way they found the middle was by calculating halfway the center of gravity, so the center of the piece of pipe, and then they wrapped the bag once around, and then a second time around, so the handles of the super sack were pointed forward, and they hooked those handles up to a crane. Then they took a piece of rope and tied some very tight knots to keep the bag as secure as possible. They lifted the bag with the crane, and they started to move the load towards the boat. Now, the crane never moves because it's on a concrete platform on the beach. And the biggest hazard these workers have is suspended overhead load. You never want a person underneath a suspended overhead load. And because the crane never moves, the load always flies in the same place. And so what the guys did is they figured out long ago where the danger zone was. And in that danger zone, they put some small fences and some red X's on the beach. This kept people from beneath the suspended load while they loaded the crane. So they lift this pipe up, and it's very curiously balanced, and they start to swing the load towards the vessel. And what do you think happens next? You're right. It has to fall, because if it doesn't fall, this is the dumbest story on earth. And it does. And it falls hard. And it hits the beach, and it breaks this piece of equipment into a lot of small pieces. Now, this will fit in a bag. But when it falls exactly where they predicted it would fall. It lands inside that exclusion zone. Operations halted because they broke a very important piece of equipment. But when it fell exactly where they predicted it would fall in case it fell. Nobody got hurt, but operations ceased. Here's my question for you. Is this a success or a failure? So I love this case study for a bunch of reasons. One of the most important reasons I love this case study is it really sets up the idea that how an organization responds really sets the course for the future, right? I mean, that makes total sense. It's as obvious as can be. But I also love this because it really deals with this notion of uncertainty. And this idea that somehow our determination, how we respond matters, really sets the course for how we move forward and develop and learn is really vital to how organizations thrive. And in fact, I would suggest that's a part of what we want to capture today. Because one thing we know for sure, the future is uncertain. It's uncertain. We know that. But I think I bring good news to the table. And the good news I bring to the table for you guys is that the future's always been uncertain. There's nothing really new or incredibly novel about the fact that we're really pretty awful at understanding what's going to happen next. That's always been a part of the human condition. And it's a huge part of what we want to talk about now. Now, the idea that somehow we can control the future is really important. And companies really struggle with a bias towards prevention, the idea that everything that can happen must be prevented. What the pandemic and the associated crises, which is the plural of crisis, has done for us is really emphasize, kind of put a highlighter around the idea that we're not very good at understanding what's going to happen next. Plans can't plan for unexpected events. I mean, if we could plan for unexpected events, they wouldn't be unexpected events. They'd be a part of our plan. And so the idea that we've set up for years, and you guys have been a part of this journey, a huge part of this journey, is that we really need to redefine what success looks like. Success for us is not the absence of failure, right? I mean, safety is not the absence of failure. It's never been the absence of failure. Unfortunately, our systems, our processes, our culture, our dogmas have told us that safety is an outcome to be achieved, right? And so we measure safety by counting the people we hurt. We look at safety as an end product. We just did a high-risk job. Nobody got hurt. Therefore, we were safe. Safety for us is not the absence of a negative. It's the presence, really, of a positive. It's the presence of capacity. And that's how I want you to think about bouncing forward from multiple crises that have impacted your business and the organizations you work with and for. Because this has been a relatively significant intervention. And this is a big deal. And the big deal part of this is really important for us to talk about because our language, the language we've been talking about for years, that language really resonates now because organizations understand the value of resilience. Capacity is crazy, you guys, because building capacity in a system and not using it is really expensive. We know that. I mean, we've been a part of that conversation for years and years and years. However, now what we understand is not having capacity in a system when you need it is really frickin' expensive. And so that's kind of a part of how we want to think about it. And to do that, I want to build a pretty interesting case. And it starts around the notion of brittleness. So a fragile organization, a fragile system, a fragile part of the process is pretty easy to understand. It moves along relatively seamlessly. It seems like it's working great. And then some event happens, some uncertainty happens, a variability happens, and the system fails catastrophically. Think toilet paper availability during the initial part of the quarantine in the United States. I mean, for the most part, the toilet paper supply was wiped out. It's a lot of work to get to that joke, but I wanted to say the word toilet paper and wiped out in the same sentence. So that's a part of it, right? Now, a fragile system is important. So let's talk about what we know. And these are things we've known a long time, but now we kind of have a language and really a pretty strong case study to talk about. So we know some things for sure. Organizations really want a predictive and controllable future. I mean, think about it. I think about, in my experience, talking about the idea of reliability as sort of defined by having exactly what we want to have happen in our organizations. That's nothing more than this incredible hunger for a predictive and controllable future. The problem is that the future as we understand it, and we are going through a big set of case studies right now, is really conditioned on this idea of multiple complex development. Now, think about complexity as a term of art, not complicated, because complicated means it's difficult to do, and lots of stuff in life's difficult to do. But complexity really draws you to the interrelatedness, the interconnectedness, and the interdependencies in which our systems survive. Now, we always impact the future by decisions we make now. That makes sense, right? So think butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in Kansas, and Charles gets spikier hair in Texas. I mean, that's the butterfly effect, right? Now, each development is always, in reality, unpredictable. So we've just built a case that uncertainty is normal and that humans, organizations, leaders, managers, bosses, owners, consultants desire predictability. The problem is it's really, really difficult and stupid, notice I highlighted that word, to try to predict the future in order to control the future. We have to accept one fundamental reality, and that is we don't know what we don't know. We have to accept our ignorance. We simply don't know what will happen. And so our strategy has to change in the midst of uncertainty. Ready for this, guys? To one of capacity, not of probability. Now, this should make some sense to you. But in a way, we're sort of tipping at some pretty significant traditional ideas that our organizations have held tightly to. And that's the idea that somehow we can prioritize and risk rank all operational interfaces so that we can actually control the future of that interface. And what we've learned is it's just wrong. Growing up in the Department of Energy, like I did, because I'm just a baby now, right? We used to have a term that we used all the time, and it was an idea that is really important now, and it's called events beyond safety basis. We're really in a world now that's kind of beyond our safety basis. What we could not have imagined happened. And suddenly, that model that we talked about as fragile starts to need to look different. It starts to need to look like a resilient model. And resilience is really interesting. And we'll talk about resilience a little bit because I want to get you guys in HPRCT to join me on a relatively significant campaign. I don't ever want to use the word resilience without using the word robust. And I want to really draw some delineations between the difference between a robust response and a resilience response. And that's coming. That's around the corner, right? A resilience model says pretty much what the fragile model said. The plan's humming along. You see it right there, kind of humming, maybe a little bit of variability. There's a wiggle in that line. And then something happens, an event takes place, uncertainty, a variability, right? The system has the ability to absorb, so recover, right? It gives the worker some time. And then once it absorbs and recovers, the system has the ability to learn and adapt. And this idea of absorbing, recovering, learning, and adaption, well, to a great extent, that is the definition of what HPRCT has talked about really since its origin. Now, suddenly, this is significant. We've always known it's important, but it's really significant. And part of what's happened is we've moved into what's called a VUCA environment. Now, lots of you are going to know the term VUCA because it's been around a while, especially in our world. VUCA was really developed by the special operations teams in the United States military. It was researched tremendously, kind of a lot of research came out of Harvard around this idea of what a VUCA environment is like. And VUCA is an acronym, and you guys should be incredibly comfortable with acronyms because for the love of God, your organization is called HPRCT. There are millions of better names than HPRCT. Let's just put that out there, all right? VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Now let's define these really quickly. Not that you need to, but I think it's worthwhile. Volatility really talks about the idea that the environment that you're in is incredibly dynamic, and it's demanding that you respond quickly to ongoing changes that are relatively constant. Pretty good definition of where we are now, right? Uncertainty is pretty simple. That means that you're having to make decisions without the normal data sets that you traditionally have relied upon to move forward strategically. So that's uncertainty. Complexity is interdependent, interrelated, intercoupled systems, complex systems. Think Jenga blocks. There's one that fell down right behind me, so you can kind of see that. And then finally, the notion of ambiguity, probably my favorite thing to talk about. And ambiguity really hits the idea that the environment in which you're entering is unfamiliar and it's outside of your expertise. You are now doing things that you've never done before. Think Rasmussen, think knowledge base, think this idea of ambiguity. Now, VUCA has required leaders to change their strategy. And this has provided a tremendous amount of discomfort to leaders. This has not been an easy change. The good news, if there is good news in the midst of this, is that they didn't have a lot of choice about it. They didn't get to push back very hard. They were sort of acted into leading differently. And there's really two ways to change leaders. You can teach them to lead differently, or you can act them into leading differently. And the second one really became relatively significant here. And here's what sort of changed. Leaders had to become very adept at making early decisions based upon smaller data sets and understanding that agility is a capacity. Suddenly now leadership has to make decisions not in that long-term strategic venue that we've always been quite comfortable in, but actually in short-term chunks. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is the ability to change. Agility really has gone from a bug to a feature. Where we used to think leaders that changed their mind all the time sucked as leaders, now what we're realizing is that agility in the leadership level is actually a pretty important sense of capacity. And that's really important. And one of the things that I'd add to you guys is that during uncertainty, I would suggest decision-making actually becomes easier. I want you to think about that a moment because it's really important. Decision-making becomes easier. And the reason decision-making becomes easier is because you actually move to your corner faster. You move to the worst-case scenario much quicker. Because the idea that you can somehow maybe luckily get through this, you could weasel your way through this system, has kind of gone away as the very foundation upon which businesses and operations have been built has started to be in question. So, second leadership tool that has been an abrupt change for leaders is that they've been required to seek diversity of opinion. Now, this is something that we've talked about for a long time. In fact, I would suggest one of the strongest things that HPRCT brings to the world is the ability to really give a voice to the workers and allow the workers to have really some ability to tell how work is actually done, right? This idea of seeking diverse opinions really allows leaders to recognize that expertise for operations lives at every single level of the organization. The janitor has expertise on operations as the CEO has expertise on operations. And what's interesting about that is that those expertise are both incredibly valuable and both incredibly different. And the counter to this is that during high stress times, oftentimes leaders want to draw inward. They want to go into the conference room, shut the door, and build a little silo because it's protected and safe. But in fact, during a VUCA environment, more diversity allows better data sets quicker and really creates better conversations. So building that diversity is really, really valuable. Third thing, leaders have had to learn to temporarily trade short-term certainty for long-term stability. And this was painful. This is painful. Because long-term stability in the old world aligned towards efficiency, shareholder value, profits, better, faster, cheaper, right? That was super sexy. But now the idea of long-term stability, that's kind of gone away. I was talking to a relatively high-up leader in the maritime industry the other day, and he said to me, one of the challenges operationally now is I cannot make a plan much longer than a day. And my response to him is, well, your workers have been really comfortable with that for a long time. Welcome aboard. Wasn't very satisfying, but I think he needed to hear me say that. That idea that they can create short-term certainty actually allows the organization to have a little structure and guidance. And then finally, the fourth requirement for leaders is they've had to shift from the idea of measuring to monitoring. So if you've read much Carl Weick or Eric Hallnagel, those guys have been talking about monitoring as one of the tenets of a high reliability organization for a long time, a long, long time. I mean, long time. I mean, I had hair. That's how long. I mean, a long time, right? I don't think I ever really snapped to the idea that monitoring is different than measuring, but monitoring is different than measuring. And really it has to do with the future and uncertainty and linear systems versus complex systems. So measuring is really good in a linear system. So a pump that breaks down really warrants the use of measuring, because measuring looks at a discrete component and actually snapshots that discrete component, put some kind of numerator on it, we put some kind of value on it, and we can actually health check that system at that moment by deconstructing the system to its smallest parts. But as you've learned in the past 3 days, in a complex system, the emergent nature of all the individual parts collectively creating a new outcome, which is sort of the definition of emergence and definitely the definition of complexity, well, it doesn't lend itself very well to the idea of metrics, but it does lend itself very well to the idea of monitoring. And what's happening is we're moving from these discrete, oftentimes historic, backward-looking values, metrics, to these more forward-looking vectoring values that help us understand the direction the organization is moving. That's really important. In fact, it's going to come up again in this presentation. One of the things I would suggest is the traditional metrics we've used to determine the health and wellness of a business are no longer as valuable as they were 8 months ago. That's a VUCA environment. Now, what's interesting is out of this VUCA environment, I would ask you a question. Because if we're not pausing long enough to do some kind of after or mid-action review, we're stupid. Because one of the first questions I'd ask you is, based upon what's happened in your company, your consultancy, your organization, whoever you work with, where is the capacity in your organization? And you learned it. So I spent a bunch of time talking to senior leaders throughout this entire journey, a lot of time. And one of the more interesting things to me is they're so amazed at how when we went to essential workers, essential functions, when lots of people stayed at home, but some people still had to come to work, that the work got done, and it was done effectively and efficiently. It was done with very few injuries, because most organizations that I hang out with, most of those organizations had fewer injuries during the essential worker period than they've ever had before. And one of the things they realized is that workers created that capacity adaptively by going in and doing the work. But part of the challenge is that many of the rules, procedures, policies, the things that we've really held on tightly to, they were the first things to go when the system became stressed. We count on workers to complete work planning. We've always counted on workers to complete work planning. And what's interesting is when we tested the system, a lot of the recoverability and adaption, the agility to allow our organization to be successful, fell squarely on the fact that the workers really brought to the forefront the talent. And what's amazing is, and this feedback I've gotten a bunch, and this surprises me, which is why I want to share it to you, is many of these high-level managers have really dealt with the fact that had this pandemic happened 10 years prior, they didn't have the technology to actually deliver the product that they could deliver now. Now, here's where this kind of takes its point. Is David Woods and I and Decker and I started talking about this in our little calls where we complain about each other. And we decided there were really 5 things that this crisis has taught us. And I think these 5 things for us in HPRCT are really important for us to think about and write down. You can have all these slides. You can always have all my slides. That's not a problem. But these things I think were pretty important and significant. And I want to warn you before we get into them, some of them are pretty scary, and some of them are actually quite encouraging given the culture of the group we're talking to now. So the crisis has taught us 5 things. Number 1, our systems fundamentally are really brittle, right? The toilet paper shortage, the great toilet paper shortage of 2020 is really an indicator of a relatively brittle global supply chain, right? Number 2, anticipation has not been seen as a legitimate strategy. And it hasn't, partially because of that idea around metrics and monitoring. Number 3, We suck at learning. We're terrible at applying lessons learned to future state. We're just terrible at it. Number 4, there's a relatively significant loss of reciprocity. And we're seeing that at least culturally in the United States. But I'm also feeling some vibe globally around that very same idea. And I'll explain what that means. And finally, and most importantly, learning and adaption are fundamental to building resilience, reliability, and capacity, right? Those 5 lessons are really valuable. In fact, you could probably take off on these and go to lots of places and talk about these 5 things. But let's talk about them a little bit individually. Let's start with the idea of brittle systems. So our systems are brittle, and for the most part, we knew it, but didn't know it. So denial is a really important tool psychologically. Denial is why you can say that your dryer is shrinking the size of your pants. That's denial. These pants fit yesterday, they don't fit today. That damn dryer is shrinking my pants, right? But denial is not terribly important or valuable when you're building resilience. In fact, one of the things we want to challenge is this idea that not knowing is not a good place to be. And when you look at systems, I really look at 3 types of systems. These are pretty easy. The most fragile of all systems is a non-robust system, right? So that's a system when something happens, variability, boom, the system fails miserably. We have those systems in our organization. And in a way, you can look at the recent crisis that we've been involved in as a relatively powerful way to audit, assess, and validate where our systems are weak. That's important data for us to know. I wish we'd have known it beforehand, but now we've learned it, right? The second system we see, which I see much more often, which I would suggest is much more scary, is the idea of a stable, non-robust system. That's a system that when variability happens, the system appears to handle it until it doesn't. The third one is a resilient system. In fact, you talked about it yesterday. An anti-fragile system is a good way to look at that. That's a system that couples the word resilience and robustness. Now remember, I told you those 2 words matter. Well, here we go. Let's have that conversation. A robust and resilient system, when variability happens, the system responds because it's variability, but it has the power to recover. Now, here's why this matters. When you think about the word robust and resilient, I want you to think about a dam, okay? Now, I'm not saying dam like a dirty word, okay? I'm saying dam like a thing that holds back water. So when you hear me say dam, it's not the curse word, it's the water holder backer. So now get ready, because I'm about to tell you a damn story. And I tell a lot of damn stories, and this is another damn story about a damn dam. Are you ready? A dam is both robust and resilient. Your organization needs to be both robust and resilient, because one isn't good without the other. The dam has to hold the water back. That's robust. But when the dam fails, and every dam fails, when the dam fails, having a place to put the water, spillways, secondary containments, right, a river that can be used in an emergency, that's the notion of resilience. And this idea of robust and resilient response becomes a really significant part of how we think about and manage ahead. Now, let's look at the second one, because the second one's really important, and that's the idea of anticipation. Now, we talk about anticipation as if it's a meaningful word. And what we're really talking about is the ability to listen to weak signals, early detection. Now, part of our challenge is that anticipation, weak signals, have not been seen as important indicators. And a great example of that would be the way we look at event learning. So we do something really stupid, and we've done it for a really long time. And that is we wait for an accident to study a system. So something goes bad, we do a full-blown, gigantic, deep dive investigation, and we study the failure in order to describe what normal looks like. That's dumb. And it's always been dumb. I mean, it pays the bills, and it's a part of what we do, but it seems like the timing of that's really wrong. And this is because anticipation is really not seen as legitimate. The transverse of this is that what we ought to really do is study normal work carefully, deep dive, full-blown investigation on what normal looks like in order to determine where potential failure modes exist in a system. And failure modes can be described lots of different ways. You're a good group to have that conversation with because you know a lot of different ways. But suffice it to say, I look for places where risk is high and controls are low, right? That's a potential weak spot in the system. That's a brittleness, that's fragility, and that's a part of what we want to try to understand, right? All of this really boils down to the idea that we began early with, which is the premise that we don't really get to manage uncertainty, right? I mean, we never get to manage uncertainty because it's uncertain. What we manage is our ability to have uncertainty. And anticipation, early detection of weak signals becomes really vital in understanding that, which takes us to the third one, which is the idea that we suck at learning. We do not apply lessons learned well. And I'm looking at you right now in the eye. Can you see me? Let me give you a little closer one. Ready? We're terrible at lessons learned. But let's talk about this in a little different way. So I never like to give a list of why things suck. I always want to give kind of an alternative positive outcome. But in this case, let me do it that way. Let's talk about why we suck at learning. And the first one is that we see learning as an output challenge. So we worry about how are we going to diffuse lessons learned? How are we going to create an accounting system where we can track and trend lessons learned? How are we going to get emails that people will actually read? How are we going to get lessons learned out to the crew? And one of the interesting things about that is that I would suggest lessons learned program, learning from past events, is not an output problem. In fact, perfect becomes the enemy of good. And we worry so much about how to get this information out that we actually impede our ability to put the information in. Learning is an input challenge, not an output challenge. Think Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If the learning is good enough, people want to learn it. In fact, people will beat a trail to your door to learn something from you. You know this is true, right? And it makes me think about the fact that part of this has to do with the questions we ask. So Betty Sue Flowers at Texas A&M, howdy. You have to say Texas A&M and howdy in the same sentence. I love Betty Sue Flowers. She's probably the world's foremost expert on learning. And she says, and first of all, her name's Betty Sue. So like if there was a pie, if there were two pies and I brought them in and I said, hi, you guys, I brought two pies today. One of them Dean made and the other one was made by Betty Sue Flowers. Which pie would taste better? Is there any question? Betty Sue's pie is going to taste better. I mean, it's just going to be a better pie, right? Betty Sue Flowers says, if you're not getting the answer you want from your organization, it's not your organization, it's your question. And the power we have is in realizing that learning is a function of writing good questions. Better questions give better answers. Second, we have a real strong urge to hold on to the old metrics because we know how to measure them and we got systems to count for them. And our raise is based upon them. And our safety bonus is given based upon those metrics. And so we hold on to these stupid metrics. Karsten Bush just wrote a book that says, if it's hard to measure, maybe we should stop measuring it. There's a lot of power in that young man's statement. That's a very significant piece of information. We're going to have to let go of some of the things that we traditionally measure. Third thing, we fail to recognize data when it smacks us in the face. Everything that happens in your organization is data. Everything. And so understand that you want to shoot wide, diverse targets to collect data from lots of places. Fourth one, we wait on perfect. I don't know how many meetings you've been to, but I've been to a bazillion where people actually sit around a room and talk about creating leading safety metrics. We need leading safety metrics. I've told you this before, and I'm sure I'll say it again. There are no leading safety metrics. If there were, we'd have them. Big companies would have paid for them. Chevron and BP would have bought them for us and given them to us, right? Don't wait for the perfect metric. Monitor, don't measure. The fifth one, humility. bosses think they already know. And if they think they already know, then they have a confirmation bias, and they go out and actually put on these blinders and look for crap they understand and can talk about. And then the last one, DOE people in the room will understand this. There's a strong lack of DPO. If you don't know what DPO is, it's a term that we've used for years, differing professional opinion. Create an environment where it's okay for people to disagree with you. It's got to be okay for people to disagree with you. But here's the kicker on learning. We have to see learning as a deliberate improvement strategy. Learning needs to be a part of our strategic plan. Learning needs to be a part of what we talk about. Learning is a deliberate act. It's not serendipitous. It's not an accident. We learn on purpose. Fourth change, there's a loss of reciprocity. So here's what we know. In order for you to have the right to talk to workers after they've had an event, you have to have talked to the workers before they had the event, right? I mean, that's really significant for us. We have to understand that the relationships we've built within our community, within our organizations, within our peer groups, within our competitors, within our industries, those relationships were one of the greatest sources of capacity during a multiple crisis event. But it means that we have to change the way we see workers. And I can't say this enough. And honestly, you guys, I need your help. You need to help me say this. We have traditionally seen workers as outsiders, as uninformed, robots, single issue, right? Kind of stupid, shallow knowledge, process users. That's one of the things when these CEOs tell me, I'm amazed at how our workers solved all these problems without us. I want to kind of look at them in the face and say, what's wrong with you? Do you think they didn't have that talent before this crisis? This is what these guys do. Workers aren't these things. Workers are insiders. They're incredibly smart. They're experts on your system. They know where your system's strong and weak, and they know where your system's not strong and weak, right? They're important informants. They're creative. They're problem identifiers. They're fixers. They're process owners. They're not procedural users. They're procedure owners, right? And they fail often, they fail safe, and they fail fast. Ultimately, one of the things that I think is most important is that this pandemic and all the associated crises around it has really changed access to you as a leader. So what's crazy is that the Zoom box is a great equalizer, right? Because where once a few people had some pretty high-level access to the boss, now when you're on the Brady Bunch screen, lots of people who've never talked before have found their voice. And finally, learning and adaption are fundamental. They're everything. And you guys know the black line, blue line, red line model, right? I mean, we could talk about this forever. One of the interesting things is that gap between black line and blue line, and you'll see on my slide that it's actually a white line because a black line on a black background doesn't work very well. So let's just put that out there, right? That traditional gap, the gap that we've for years tried to solve for, the gap between actual operations and operational drift, that gap, my friends, is normal. And if you need proof of that, go back in time 7 months and watch what happened, right? There's always variability and systems are constantly in flux. Where we live is not in the gap between the plan and the work. Where we live is in the gap between the actual work and the hazard, which forces us to understand that our job is to learn, and we need to learn first. Before we take any action, before we do any discipline, before we talk about the word accountability, before we move forward with some kind of corrective action program, we have to learn. Learning becomes everything because knowing less does not make you smarter, right? Testing less does not make you healthier. Everybody with me on this? Knowing more makes you smarter. Knowing less makes you dumber. And that's really how that works. So ultimately then, we should define what operational excellence is. Because really what we strive for is this notion of operational excellence. And operational excellence for us right now, defining it in a world that's moved from optimizing efficiency to optimizing resilience, operational excellence is the organization's ability to learn from itself, to constantly learn from itself. So is it worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Well, I think there's another question I'd add to you guys. And that is, you should ask this. What are we doing differently now based upon this current period of uncertainty? Learning is deliberate. Learning is an improvement strategy. Take a moment, build some time, create a space that's psychologically safe, and ask this question of everybody, diverse opinions across the board. Because the answers you're going to gather here are really important to understanding what we can take out of this. Because our goal is to not bounce back. Why on earth would we want to bounce back? Let's bounce forward. Let's come out of this stronger and smarter, more robust and more resilient. And so these strategies, these are the strategies leaders must have. Or if they don't have them, for goodness sakes, they need to develop them as quickly as possible. Numero uno, number one, they need to deliberately, read that as on purpose, right? Deliberately build resilience into your system. The days of looking at a system to deliberately create efficiency, profit, better, faster, cheaper, those days are gone, at least for a while. What we want to do now is build a system that understands that when push comes to shove, there will be enough toilet paper in the emergency toilet paper warehouse that we won't be wiped out again. I'm really getting a lot of traction out of this joke. Thank you very much, right? Secondly, we need to strengthen robustness and build resilience. We have to have both. If nothing else comes out of this pandemic for my journey, it's understanding at a much richer and deeper level that coupling between prevention and recovery, between robust and resilient, that coupling is incredibly important. One is not good without the other. Second thing, we must insist upon diversity of information. And read diversity not just as different, read it as age and experience and location and education and skill base and size and color and gender and identity. All of those things that make us diverse become incredibly valuable capacity gaining tools by expanding our worldview and understanding that perception changes based upon where you sit in the organization. Number three, replace the need to measure with the need to monitor. Have your organization understand that we fear the green and embrace the red. On your management dashboard, right? On your management scorecard, before the pandemic, green was good because green didn't need my attention, and red was bad because red was going to suck up my time. Now what we realize is that green is pretty scary, because the question you need to ask if you see a green system is, why is it green? And how long will it be green? And how much capacity for variability lives in that green? Red becomes fun because it gives you something to do. Fourth, and maybe the one I'm most interested in, and I think this is a really great one because it sort of illustrates the very fundamental reason a group like HPRCT exists, and that is build relationships as a strategy. Work on building relationships as a way to increase capacity. Be generous. So in talking to all these guys, some companies are doing really well. Some companies are really having a difficult time. One of the big delineators, one of the differences I've noticed is around the notion of generosity. When times are hard, become more generous, not less generous. Fifth one, purposely monitor the capacity to learn. Build monitoring functions into your system that really take the temperature of deliberate improvement strategies of learning, whatever learning looks like, whether it's investigations or analysis or verification and validations, even audits and assessments. Build in a way to purposely monitor, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we staying the same? The capacity to learn. And then finally, last but not least, hold on to the principles of human performance. Because those principles, when times get tough and uncertainty starts flying its head around and the crap really starts flying and wasps start killing you and wineries burn down, right? The one thing you can base decision-making on, the one thing you can base strategic planning on, the one thing you can do to create certainty today is to understand that those principles are the guiding forces around how decisions are made. People make mistakes. Blame fixes nothing. Learning is everything. Context drives behavior, and how we respond matters. Absence a crisis, what we need, what we should take out of this are 5 things. Build resilience, insist on diversity, replace the need to fix with the need to analyze, build relationships as a strategy, and monitor learning. Because resilience is not the absence of uncertainty. Resilience is the presence of capacity. Dean, they're all yours, baby. Are you still in your pajamas?
No, does this look like PJs? This is my
Yeah,
pie
kinda.
outfit, my friend. I make a good pie.
Okay, well, the proof is in the pie, brother.
Well, I'll have one shipped immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody. So Todd, thank you very, very much. And thank you for the commentary on my beautiful red wardrobe. And everybody, here we go. This is Q&A time. So what I'd love to do is let's start with some dialogue. Who's got a question? I think there might be a few out there. So who wants to get us kicked off with some discussion? Go ahead and raise a hand, or just if you unmute yourself, then I'll just bring you into the conversation. And I might go, so Bill Cafaro. Bill, what do you think?
Oh, I love it. I love the presentation format. I'm not just putting the slides up. I stole that from Todd. And what I love is the connection. You closed with the statement that you used to, I think the words, if you were to substitute the words, you said safety and defenses. Working in a manufacturing environment where my job, my human performance work is done with respect to manufacturing, and so our fatality is discard, which is a much lighter thing to happen. Trying to bring human performance into the organization, I basically have taken the position that human performance is not safety, human performance is resiliency. And I think this presentation really supported that.
Thanks, man. So it's cool that you bring this up. All of us have many, many different criticality things. I mean, we have things that are critical to us. And what's amazing is things are critical to production, critical to quality, critical to operations, critical to manufacturing, critical to safety, critical to environment. And we can make a giant list of those things, right? What's important is understanding those criticalities allows us to look at them not in a predictive, preventive fashion, although that's important, but that hasn't done a lot of good for us. It allows us to really move our thinking towards this notion of robust and resilient, where we're looking at not only the ability to hold up to production and manufacturing pressure, but to have resilience when that manufacturing pressure fails. So that's a good idea. It's all about the controls, baby.
One last thing I could throw at what you said about learning. So through these presentations that I do, I found an event from 2017 where a pilot almost took out 5 other planes. And what I did was I paralleled that to a manufacturing event where we had a $3 million discard. And the error precursors and the latent error all fit. I mean, they were analogous. And of course you had the outcome. And I think that opened up. The other thing, when you talk about learning, I brought maybe 500 people through this course. And my point was, nobody had heard about it because it happened in 2017 and it had a good outcome.
Right.
And I'd ask, who's heard about this? Who's heard about this? Do you think you would have heard about this if you took one of those planes out? I had one person. I had one person who said, I heard about this. I was like, wow, really? I said, yeah. He said, I'm a pilot. And I was like, see, we need to communicate the way they communicate.
Right. Right. And they've got systems to do that. That's a really important one. Thank you. That's cool.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And Adam Cunningham, your hand's up. Adam, what's your question?
Yeah, so we've been seeing this term getting a lot of traction from your compatriots, you know, Bob Edwards and Andrea Baker and all of them talking about monitoring. And it makes sense. I get it. I want a video clip instead of a Snapchat and instead of, a snapshot of what's going on. But it still feels sort of nebulous. It's still a lot of talk about it and just says monitoring. I'm just wondering, do you have some examples, practical examples of what good looks like with monitoring?
That's the same question Tanya's asking as well. I just read that in the comments. I think that's a good question. So first of all, I would take issue with one thing. Well, no, I have a ton of things I want to take issue with, but let's just pick one thing for now. And that is the metrics, although we really want them to be very precise and seductive, they're actually relatively subjective and nebulous as well. I mean, we choose what we measure, and don't think for a moment that we don't choose crap that's easy to measure that reinforces our bias, right? So metrics kind of fall into the whole nebula area as well. But the example I would give, and it's just because it's really on my brain right now, because I just dealt with it for a long time yesterday, but there's a ton of them. And that is organizations, the organization I was working with yesterday is really changing the way they're doing pre-job briefs, a big construction company, right? And traditionally what they've done is they've measured the number of pre-job briefs that they do. And they hold the field supervisor accountable by bonus to X number of pre-job briefs per week. So they got to do like 9 a week, right? So you know what happens. We can write the end of that story. That is, you get to Thursday and you're like, crap, I got 6 more pre-job briefs to do. So I'm going to go out this afternoon and do 3, and I'll go out tomorrow and do 3 more, and I'll catch up, right? One of the things they've done, and they're really struggling with this idea of moving metrics from sort of discrete metrics to monitoring, is they've now taken the pre-job briefs and they've thrown away the requirement for the number of briefs. And now what they do is they ask the supervisor to identify, I think it's 6 key words that came out of the pre-job brief discussions. And then they've put these key words in a software that actually, it's kind of like the softwares that make word clouds. It's kind of like that, only it's a little bit, I suppose it will make a word cloud. But what it does is it allows them to actually then trend for words that are showing up as the key identifiers in their pre-job briefs. And one of the things we talked about yesterday is having the supervisor pick the words a good way. Are there other ways to catch the words? I mean, they're thinking about how to sort of gather that narrative analysis of the pre-job brief. Now, what's interesting is I would suggest that moves you from a discrete linear metric, how many did we do this week, to a much more subjective way to monitor what the topics of the pre-jobs are. And they've been running this little pilot program for maybe a month, maybe a little longer. And they're in love with what they're getting based upon this keyword identification. Because now they can trend that all of a sudden excavation is really getting a lot of traction in pre-job. So then they can go out and validate and verify the controls present and necessary for excavation. So that's just one example. It's kind of a long example. I mean, there's a bazillion of these I can think of, but that's the one that I was dealing with yesterday afternoon. And that's a really mature way to look at pre-jobs. And what it does is it gives really the safety team in this company, but it also gives leadership a whole different data set, a much different data set than how many pre-jobs were done. Because I would suggest, and I saw that Jake put The Tyranny of Metrics up, which is a book, if you've not read, you should read. I would suggest knowing how many pre-jobs were accomplished between us chickens, and I don't think anyone else is listening, incredibly non-value added metric. So, and most of the metrics, at least in my career, I mean, I would challenge you guys on the call. In my career, most of the metrics that they made me measure didn't really have a lot of value to me. I mean, they just weren't good. Monitoring is really a philosophical shift, but it's a shift that we've been talking about in I mean, look at Hallnagel's the 4 pillars of resilience, right? Or Weich's stuff around the 5 pillars of a highly reliable organization. Both of them talk about monitoring. They don't talk about measuring. They talk about monitoring. That help?
Yeah, it does.
Give me kind of an uncertain look. Is that a refrigerator behind you?
Yeah, nice old 50s model right there.
Nice, baby. I like that. That looks good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks, Adam. And Todd, awesome example with the language, and how they're mining for words and what's coming up in the conversations. And lots of thoughts in the chat about that. Sharon Small, you had a comment. Can I just bring you in on that one? Sharon, you can just unmute yourself if you would like.
It seems personal when you say it that way, Dean.
I know. Sharon.
Well, Sharon. Well, her question, I'll stall it until she gets on. Her question says, what if the workers chose the words? And that's exactly where they're in that same place. So I think the reason they had the supervisors pick the words initially during the pilot is because it was easy to manage the pilot data. And now that they've had success, they're very, very interested. I might add, Sharon, they're less interested in the supervisor selection and much more interested in what the workers think. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, so that's part of that bottom-up modeling that I was talking about yesterday. It's like when you have somebody choosing what's most salient, if they're not modeling well, if they're not able to hold the information, they're not going to be choosing what's actually most important to the people that they're talking to. And I know this because I teach people how to listen. I teach people how to ask questions. And we see it all the time, people modeling adjacent to what's really important and choosing from their own frame of the world. So it's good to hear that workers are getting more input.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I can see why. So initially, I should just tell you this. Initially, they wanted to videotape all the pre-jobs. So that's the dumbest idea known to mankind because, well, for the workers, the fear that those would become weaponized and used against them is really high. And I get that. I completely, especially in some industries. Some industries have, maybe that's an unfair thing to say. Many industries, that would be create a lot of fear in the organization. But so they played around with it, and I think it'll work well. They're really happy with what's happening because it's given them a whole new set of data, and that's the power of really shifting to monitoring. It's the power from moving away from discrete, linear, very Newtonian metrics. Metrics are sexy because they're easy, but they're not very helpful.
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, you say it's more subjective, but metrics are subjective too. It's all about what you're choosing to measure, what you're paying attention to. It's
100%.
It's all putty.
100%. 100% agree with you.
Awesome. And Sharon, I owe you a pie as well for cold calling on you like that, but thanks for just jumping right in. I appreciate it. And right. Michael Donovan, your hand's up. Michael, what's your question?
Well, it's more to, first of all, I agree with the monitoring for capacity. That's excellent and fully support that. And I work for an organization that's high on maintenance. A lot of our activities is maintenance driven. So we have a work execution management cycle, planning, work preparation, pre-job briefing, work execution, post-job review, and then back to planning. Wouldn't that cycle be the monitoring, the cycle that needs to be monitored by the leaders to learn about their organizational strengths and improvement opportunities?
Yeah, I think those are the bones. I mean, those are really good bones to start that discussion. Now, I think you have to philosophically shift leaders so that they're thinking differently about that kind of that work execution cycle. I would say that's kind of a Baconian cycle. It's sort of the classic Francis Bacon problem-solving cycle, and it's a good one, right? But they have to think about it differently. And what you're doing is you're asking them to think about this as a forward-looking monitoring tool, not a backwards-looking culpability tool. So you can't weaponize that system, but you can value that system for learning. But it's an excellent comment. You can leave 5 minutes early.
Todd, just one follow-up to that. Behind you is Jenga blocks.
Right.
So the model is the mental model that we're trying to use your example to look for the missing blocks.
Right.
In as they're going out there to monitor and close them, fix them in real time. Do I understand the concept correctly?
Yeah. So understanding that different people have different perceptions of the Jenga stack. The view from the top is always different from the view from the bottom. The view from the left is different from the view from the right. Right. That's a normal sort of component of complexity. And that what's important is to understand the space the Jenga leaves when pulled. And then you'd ask this question, what do we know about that space? Is it doable? Do we need to protect, guard against it? Do we need to engineer some controls? Well, you know, whatever the path forward is. But yeah, that's a really good way to get them away from dominoes, which is a linear understanding of a system, cascading failure, chain of events. Even the Swiss cheese model, you guys, I mean, dare I say this is blasphemous, but the Swiss cheese model is a domino. It's incredibly linear to a much more complex understanding of how failure takes place.
Thank you for your comments, Todd.
No problemo.
Michael, Todd, thank you. And hey, I just, as their duly appointed facilitator, I just want to check in, be respectful of everybody's time. I think, with Todd, if you're all right, you want to go another, 8-10 minutes or so with some Q&A?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah. I don't have pants on. I'm at home with no pants on. I can go hours.
Well done. Carrie Davis, what's your question? What's your thought?
Hi, Todd. So I think this is really, really great. And there's a lot of value in what you're saying with monitoring versus measuring. My question is, I work for Shell. I work in the technology centers. So my colleagues are in India, Germany, Shanghai, and the Netherlands. How do you sell the benefit of monitoring versus measuring to a group of senior leaders who are very attached to these metrics that they measure, and they hold on to it like their life depends on it? So Shell is pretty early on the human performance journey. We're still working it into our systems. But, getting change in some of those smaller areas is really, really difficult. What's your advice on that?
So I think two things I would tell you right away. One is the universe constantly teaches me, don't shorten the training and education components for senior leaders. So senior leaders need to have that fundamentals conversation, and they need to have the opportunity to have it in a way that's long, meaningful, with the doors closed, so they can safely argue why this is different. The second thing I would encourage you to really think about, and I'm spending a lot of time talking to the Shell people, so I know they're early on the journey, is that they have to redefine what success is. So success is not the absence of failure, right? And so measuring the absence of failure isn't terribly valuable. Success is really the presence of resilience, the presence of capacity. And once you get them to move the idea from an outcome to be achieved, which is sort of traditionally how an engineering-centric company looks at it, to a capacity to manage and monitor, then the shift actually becomes easy. But it'll be a whole series of conversations that happen at every level of the organization. And it won't happen if it's not deliberate. And so build in time for the leaders to go through a deep dive, heavy lift training on human performance. I actually think the guys out on the rig floor, the guys out on a platform, they don't need this training. They totally get this. But the leaders, we're asking them to change a lot. And so it's one conversation after another. And it's important to remember that people move incrementally, so it'll be kind of a slow move. And the encouraging thing is that once they learn it, they can't unlearn it. So once you break the paradigm and you teach them this new definition, they can't really go back. I mean, and that's encouraging as well. But just keep punching, man. That's the way to do it. Slowly but surely it'll change.
Thanks. And Carrie, thanks for bringing
Todd.
that up.
Yeah.
And Jake, jump in.
Sure. Hi, Todd. It's good to see you again.
Hey, Jake, what's up, brother?
All sorts of stuff, man. Great presentation as always. I love the practical real world example in the study and the speed writing. That's very cool. And I'd heard that example before, but it's a solid one. It's a great one. What I'm looking for are the practical stuff. I love the theories and the concepts, but what I'm looking for are the examples. Like if we were talking HRO, we can talk theory all day, but at some point we'll get down to the flight deck crews of aircraft carriers, wilderness firefighters, air traffic controllers, like they're the original HROs. Do you have any examples, especially of industries or teams that we might be non-obvious, that most of us wouldn't know about, that are really at the spearhead of really doing practicing the stuff that you're suggesting?
Yeah, so look at construction. Construction's really, for some crazy reason, construction's really picked up on this. I don't really, other than they don't want to kill people and hurt people, and they want high quality product, and they don't want stuff to fall down. I get that. But there's a lot of work going on in the construction industry right now, and I think it's being really driven by their insurance strategies they use in construction, how they kind of self-insure each other, the idea of a captive. So there's dramatic work being done around things like pre-job. A better way to talk about it is really pre-job is the term that we would understand, but the idea of starting when safe, which is, so they've actually looked at removing stop when unsure.
Yeah.
I have to say this so carefully because it sounds so risky. So the stop work authority is fundamentally dumb, and it's always been dumb. It feels right, and it feels morally like the right thing to have, and every worker should have the authority to stop a job. Fair enough, right? The problem is that if you look at how failure happens, and if you use the definition that an accident is an unexpected combination of normal performance variability, which is kind of the fancy pants definition of accident, right? Then it's really difficult to identify a system that's failing in order to stop it before it fails, right? If you can, you should, and people do all the time. But I promise you, I just did a fatality where a guy was replacing a hatch cover, and he picked up the hatch cover to put it on the hole that was on the deck, right? And when he picked it up to move it, what he didn't know is he had actually picked up a hatch cover that was covering another hole, and the hatch cover he really wanted was on the other side, but there were many hatch covers on this deck. And so he picked up the hatch cover and basically walked through an open hole that he just opened to his death. Okay, right? So I promise you, had he known that hatch cover would kill him, he'd have stopped the job, right? And so construction's been really struggling with that. And one of the things they said is, we can't manage uncertainty. We don't know the multitude of ways that the system will fail on a construction site, but what we can manage is really controls. And so they've actually identified the essential controls that are necessary to do this job. When it fails, this is what we count on to not die or not have a quality escape or whatever the criticality is they're trying to control for. And then they actually do a start work criteria. And that's been really interesting and really practical. And what's been amazing about that is that the organizations that have done that have had really dramatic success around sort of high risk fatality and significant event numbers. So that'll read it. And that's one of the reasons Shell's interested right now in human performance, is not because they want to be more reliable. They're pretty reliable. They just want to stop killing people, right? And the way you stop killing, you'll never prevent a fatality, and yet we prevent fatalities all the time. You'll only control for a fatality.
Yeah, so, well, the question is, what can you measure the fatalities that you prevent? It's like a police officer measure, what's better, the numbers of people that you arrest or the number of arrests that you prevent. Those are the things.
So embrace your PhD and remember that it's impossible. There's an absence of a null set. So if you have no null set, you can't measure what didn't happen. And so we make these artificial, we have this high need to understand what didn't happen. So we create all these artificial requirements. What we can measure really is the verification and validation of controls present. And that becomes, so now what used to be the life-saving rules are kind of stupid, right? Because that's 8 ways to get fired or 8 ways not to die. What we ought to take is those life-saving rules and turn them into life-saving controls. These are the 8 controls we count on when systems fail. That's just one example, but I mean, that's a good question. It's a hard question.
Any other construction is a huge industry. There's all kinds of different construction. I don't expect you to name names of companies, but can you narrow that down, a particular segment of the construction industry that you think these guys and women are really doing well? Or is there one other example of another industry that you do these, and because they're the leaders? Any suggestions on that?
The good part about this, Jake, is that your signal broke up. And so I don't know what you ask, but I'm pretty certain whatever you ask is too damn hard of a question to answer. So I'm going to answer it by saying this. Yes, that's a really good idea, Jake. Thanks. Brilliant question.
All right. Thanks.
I really didn't hear it, so.
That's okay. No worries. Thanks.
Awesome, Jake. Thanks for jumping in there. And it looks like we have one more question. Rob Fisher. Rob, it looks like you.
Rob.
Here.
Hey, Todd.
Hola, Rob. ¿Qué pasa?
Goodo. I just wanted to chime in very quickly about one of the things we've been using successfully with leaders on difference between measuring and monitoring is observations. They use those to go measure things, but engagements can be used to monitor. So the difference between an observation is you go watch something. The difference between an engagement is you go have a conversation on something, and then you go back and tell people what you learned from that conversation.
I think that's a great piece of feedback. I think that's you can grab that. That's a concept that you can grab and they can get. And I agree with you completely. I've been really playing with the idea of the difference between audit and validate too, which is kind of in that same vein that we audit to determine if to discover deficiency, and we validate to actually assure resilience. And that's kind of a philosophical shift that exists in there as well. Good comment, Rob. Thank you.
Okay, I made a mistake. I think we might have one more question, and that is Doug Sistrunk. Doug, I see your hand going up and then coming back down, and maybe you're just waving at us. But Doug, if you want to jump in here, please do. And
well, I did have some comment, but you guys kind of covered it. But so we ran into the same type of thing. We're actually applying HPI to documents, and we had the same type of thing coming back, like, how do you measure? Because they are big into numbers. And we actually came up with an overview that shows them exactly what we're trying to do, exactly the differences, and some examples on how, problems get caught out there. And it's just like Todd said, you can't measure what you stop beforehand. So showing them and showing them the step differences and what can be avoided by doing it the right way has actually got senior leadership on board, even though they can't measure it with an exact number. The buy-in from the craft and the buy-in from the leadership together is what's pushing us forward. And that's what's actually overall driving the, less of the, hey, you're going to be in trouble, and more of the, let's figure out how we can make this right. So getting the senior leadership's buy-in and the craft buy-in or the operator buy-in is the ultimate goal, because then you actually find out the problem, the base root of the problem from the worker, and you're able to fix it because the senior leadership is behind you. That's that exact paradigm that we're trying to get to. That's really difficult, but if you can show them exactly what you're doing, exactly what it's helping, then it kind of gives them the buy-in, even though they don't have the number. So that was just my comment.
That's a good comment too. I mean, I think of it kind of like this, Doug. You're looking more holistically, and you're using words like engagement, buy-in, mind shift. You didn't use that word, but I would add that in, sort of changing minds. That's really what we want. And it's hard to measure those things, but you can monitor them. Like I think about pumpkin pie, right? This is clearly a pie-centric presentation, just in case you're wondering. But pumpkin pie is pretty much pumpkin pie. The difference between the best pumpkin pie I've ever had in the world and the worst pumpkin pie is not very much. It'd be hard to measure that, but you know a good pie when you eat it. And that's a part of it. And what it boils down to, kind of my last words, Dean, is in a classic traditional linear system, right? we reduce the system down to its individual parts, which is really the essence of the term root cause, right? That we take the system apart and we look for the root cause, right? In a complex system, we don't ever deconstruct it to its individual pieces. You don't look at each individual Jenga. You look at the relationship the Jenga blocks have with each other. And those relationships and interactions are more important than the individual pieces. So the Jenga piece itself is just a block of wood. But when you pull the Jenga, it changes the relationship, the interactions that the Jengas have with each other. You can't measure that. I mean, using traditional metrics, you can't deconstruct it to its individual parts and measure it. You've got to find different tools. And that's one of the things that this pandemic has done for us, is it's really said our traditional metrics are no longer very valuable. I mean, what we measure has changed, and that becomes a really big part of it.
Thanks, Todd. And thanks, everybody, for a super energetic conversation. And what we are going to do, just from a logistics perspective, we'll keep everything on track for the morning session, meaning that we will end at 12:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time as planned. We'll go into a break right now, and we'll come back. I'll adjust the time and what we do in the breakout groups to make sure that we stay on track. So go and enjoy a very refreshing 30-minute break. We will, almost 30 minutes. We'll come back at 11:50 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, so 28 minutes from now. We'll get into some breakout groups. I'll keep everybody on track. Todd, thank you so much. And we'll see everybody back here shortly. Okay, and it is 11:50 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to go into some breakout groups. And because we ran a little bit over budget with time during the main presentation this morning, what we're going to do is adjust. For those of you that were with us on the day one or day two, we did 2 breakout group sessions during this time period. What we're going to do is just do one today. So I'll put up the instructions in just a moment. You will be in breakouts of about 6 to 7 people. And what I'd like you to do is in your breakout groups, we're going to take about 20 minutes, maybe slightly longer. You'll be with new folks that you may not have seen before in previous breakout groups. Go through, do a brief round of introductions, and then what I'd like you to do is talk about the very specific steps you are going to take in your respective organizations to bounce forward. So, the things that you heard Todd speak about, the conversation that we had this morning, get really specific about what you're going to do to move those forward in your organizations. And then when we come back for the debrief, I would just like one person from each group to just give us a quick summary, share your insights, share the specific steps so we can kind of learn through all of this together. I will put you into the breakout groups. Ideally, you're going to be 6 to 7 people. I may juggle just a little bit in the first couple minutes to make sure we have an equal balance. And I'll be giving you instructions with the breakout or with the broadcast feature in the breakout groups as we go. And if you need help, just hit the ask for help button and I'll join your breakout groups. So I will see you back here in about 20 to 25 minutes. Enjoy. All right, it looks like we have pretty much everybody back in the large group here. So we're going to quickly go through a debrief. So I'm going to just ask each group for a volunteer to just share the key action step, the thing that you're going to do to bring this bounce forward concept to life in your organization. So group 1, who's my volunteer to give us a readout from your breakout group?
I don't remember what group number I was in, Dean.
Oh, well, then let's do it this way. Are you the volunteer, Sharon?
Apparently I'm the volunteer.
Excellent. So go ahead.
Okay, well, we very creatively came up with the acronym either SMALL, SLAM, or LAM, depending on how you want to put the letters together. And so it's sit with discomfort, learning, edu-learning, and then, M is monitor, observe, and A is anticipate. So we did the words.
I like it. Thank you. That's awesome. All right, Sharon, thank you. So breakout group, I'll still figure out what breakout group you were in. Breakout room 1 was Brandy Young, Danielle Lower, Eric Deeperink, Lisa Brooks, Matt Kilman, and another name that I can't quite make out. So for that group, do we have a volunteer?
I will be brave and volunteer.
Thank you.
Thank you for mine, because I couldn't remember what group number I was in. Same as Sharon. I'm like, oh, what group number we in? We really, we kind of talked about a bunch of different subjects, kind of focused on the bouncing forward phrase and how really we're never going to get back to where we were before. And you kind of don't want to. You want to continuously be moving forward anyways. We also touched upon learning teams and how that's helping, and the aspect of that measuring versus monitoring. And, some of the ideas that came along was, not just pre-job briefs, but there's other aspects where you can use the idea, maybe a post-job brief, for example. So we touched upon a lot of those ideas that Todd had brought up.
Awesome. Was it it sounds like it was a good discussion.
Oh, definitely. Yes. And we had a gentleman in our group who just graduated with a safety degree in December, and just how neat it is that he's able to start his career off knowing about human performance versus some of us, we were halfway through our career before this concept even was introduced. So I think it's really neat and exciting in that, we have these young bucks joining us fresh from the gate that are able to, learn all these cool concepts.
Right. And when you get into that, the whole thought about diversity of insight and opinion and experience and everything, Yahoo, yes. You guys were right in there.
Definitely.
Thank you. Okay. So breakout room 2 was Corey, Garland, Nikki, Tim, and one other person whose name I can't make out. So who's the volunteer from that breakout? Got to have one. Garland, you want to jump in?
Sure, I guess so. Our discussion was heavily around the monitor versus measure, and the challenges we face with getting acceptance from management and senior leadership to either start to move away from the metrics, the desire and the requirement, the expectation to see those metrics, and start to embrace more the monitoring, engagement, learning aspects. I think we all pretty much agree that's a real challenge. We struggled a bit with some of the ideas of how to do that, although engaging that frontline supervisor to be more out front with the workers, maybe putting some sort of metric around that, and the time they spend out front being an option.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Garland. And an interesting one. I think a lot of people might share that same kind of perspective on the challenges. So while we move on to breakout group 3, what I'd ask everybody to do, if you have any thoughts or insights to share with Garland and that breakout group, please take a moment and type them into the chat box so we can share some, some best practices or tips that you might have. So Garland, thank you very, very much. Breakout room 3 was Bob Nelms, Earl Johnson, Fred Golson, Carrie Toes, Carrie, sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Lindsay Balmer, and Sarah Mabby. So who's the volunteer from breakout 3? Earl, please.
I'm trying.
How did it go? How was that discussion?
It was good. We were right there with the previous group on monitoring versus God, my mind's went blank. How do we monitor? How do we do that and still be able to gather data to trend? We were all really struggling. You know, we like that idea of getting management out, and not just management, getting ourselves out to do monitoring. But then there's still that aspect that you want to capture, like you said, those 6 words that you discovered while you were monitoring. So how do I still enter that data and collect it and analyze it and look at it? So we like the idea, but we're struggling. So I guess that's kind of the gist of it. You know, anybody else pipe in?
Yeah. So you know what? Thanks, Earl. I appreciate that. And we've got a couple thoughts that showed up in the chat box. Maybe what we can do is circle back after we go through all the breakout groups, since we heard that common theme from a couple. But thanks, Earl. I appreciate that. Breakout 4 was Adam Cunningham, Alyssa Cruikshank, Cassie Bertelson, Robin Waterman, Rosemary Sherba, and Tanya Hewitt. So who's my volunteer? Adam, you're jumping right in. Adam, how did that discussion go?
Oh, it's good, man. It's always good. It's like preaching to the choir, though. We all get in the same room, and you can't help but have I won't say complaints, but your struggles, right? You want to share your struggles, and it helps to know if there's other things that help other people, right? So we talked some of the stuff too, monitoring, and what does that practically look like, and communication, struggles with leadership, and recurring in multiple groups I've had now is middle management being the really toughest part to get that clay layer broke up and permeate through with the learnings. Really from Todd's talk too, what struck all of us is that we've got to strike while the iron's hot. I mean, this pandemic, we will never have a better opportunity to put practical experience in somebody's face and say, yeah, you can challenge all these ideas. They may not make sense to you, but look back at the last 9 months. How can you argue with the proof is in the pudding, right? Or the pie, as Todd would tell us. Yeah. So, so we're looking at, I'm thinking about our individual organizations. What have we seen in the pandemic that will help me advance HOP in the places that I have the hardest places to deal with? Some of that is, we've seen good psychological safety through learning teams, and we talked about learning teams some. And then some of the problem with that is, though, that they've taken off and nobody even understands HOP is the philosophy behind it. They don't know anything about it. They just think learning teams fix everything. And so we got people now that want learning teams on how to fix a pump or, do different things. We even tried them and failed. So I won't say a learning team was a failure because we learned what not to do with a learning team, but, getting back and making sure that we're kind of going for alignment is what a lot of us were talking about. And also what I hope we get out of the end of this is to exchange some contact information, because I've picked up so many great ideas and help from the people that are going through the same struggles, and just a little tweak on maybe some of the ideas I've had that somebody may be further along in this process with their organization. So that's what we talked about.
Awesome. Adam, thank you for jumping in there. And, a couple things. I know a lot of folks shared, and Bob Nelms can correct me here, but a lot of folks shared contact information in advance of the conference. So that'll be available somehow. Another thought is, as we get into the optional breakout groups at 1:30 Eastern today, that's another good spot to begin to tap into, hey, what's your phone number? How can we connect, and that kind of thing. Because Adam, you nailed it. Like this opportunity to network and build this big, broad community of practice, if you will, and continue to share those insights is just awesome. So Thank you.
Thank you.
Breakout room 5 was Drew, John Kaufman, Julia Martirana, Lauren Mooney, Quentin, and Tyler. Who's my volunteer from breakout 5?
I guess I'll jump in.
Thank you, John.
So we talked a lot about also the measuring and monitoring, and we had both distribution represented, we had medical field represented. So one of the things we talked about, especially with the pandemic and not having as many face-to-face meetings, is context sometimes gets lost. So when we're measuring or monitoring versus measuring, if we identify a measurement, so one of the things that was brought up when Todd was talking was there was a certain number of pre-job briefs that were required to be done by that particular group. And conceptually, that scares the heck out of me, because the whole point of the pre-job brief is to identify hazards and focus on the job task so that we're doing that task from an operational standpoint correctly as well as safely. And if all we're doing is measuring the number of pre-job briefs we're doing, we kind of drive the complete opposite behavior of what we're trying to drive. We want that to drive good field behavior. Another thing we talked about was if people are measuring something, we've got a lot of very good people who will hit a metric that you define for them. And sometimes that doesn't, again, drive the behaviors you want. So we had a lot of discussion around that. And then we had a little bit of discussion around how we approach communications and how we talk to people, because the 5 principles Todd gave at the very end, and it got into about blame, it got into, the discussions the organization has will influence the behavior. And when we're doing a lot of things via Zoom, where we're doing them where we aren't face-to-face, where you can't see body language, you can't see those other things, we have to be careful that our words do not drive or hinder the positive aspects of the organization. And an example that we talked through was if you have an incident that occurs, sometimes we go right to blame as opposed to what's happened. And I'll give a real short example. We had a situation in our company where we had a bucket truck back into something, and there's discussion. One of our requirements is if we have a multi-person team, if we're backing up a vehicle of that size, we're supposed to use a spotter by our procedures. Well, with the pandemic, we have everybody driving individually, so we may have multiple trucks drive to a location instead of 2 people being in a truck. In the situation we talked about, the truck got there first. He was blocking a street, had to back up. In the process of backing up, he caught basically a branch of a tree and damaged the bucket. And there was discussion, well, he did that. He violated our procedure because he was in a 3-man crew. Well, if you look at it, the HP side of that will tell you he wasn't a 3-man crew at the time. He was a single person in a vehicle. He made his best judgments and caught an overhanging tree. Real hard to blame somebody in that. Now, he's still responsible from his driving license, all that standpoint, but to think of punishing somebody in that situation, it would have driven a completely wrong expectation and quite honestly would have really hindered our field workers in doing things, because they would have reacted to that obviously very negatively. And in fact, he didn't violate our procedure at the time because he was a 1-man crew. So again, the context of the words and the changes due to the evolving situation we're all dealing with, we have to make sure that our processes are reflecting current state and that we're doing decisions that make sense. So,
got it.
But we had a lot of discussion. That was basically where most of our discussion went, was around monitoring, measuring, and then how do we communicate right now.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. So thanks. So group 6 was Jacob, Jake, Joshua, Kathy, Michael, and Sandy. Who's the volunteer? Just give us a quick recap of the actions you're going to take or your discussion.
Hi, Dean. It's Mike.
Hey.
Sure. To give you a quick summary, very similar to the previous conversations, but basically it was more on the process or bounce you forward message. And I don't know if I'll speak for everybody, but I'll do my best. But really it was, if we don't have, there was a good quote in there by Jake that if you don't have a defined alternative, don't try to change all the process overnight. So we were looking at going forward is just incorporating HRO or HOP tools on our, for procedures, practices, enhance those with with the HOP tools, pre-job briefing, three-way communication, peer checking, all those types of HOP tools that can enhance the process to make sure people are working safely and move on from there. Work within and improve versus trying to change it all in one final swoop. And then we exchanged a lot of good book ideas as well.
Awesome. Book ideas. So thank you for that commentary, and book ideas are always great things to share. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Group 7 was Sharon Small. So Sharon, thank you for jumping in initially, and we'll move on to breakout room 8, which was Dan, David, Duke, and Harry.
Yeah, I'll
Duke.
go.
Yeah, thanks, Duke.
Yeah, sure. As everybody has observed, there's a common theme throughout, and that's the aspect of measure versus monitor, and talked about the challenges that exist there. We also talked heavily on learning and what that looks like, and relationships with regards to how all of this ties together. So we had some really good conversation on those three aspects.
Cool, and thanks for recognizing that common theme that's going through everything. I appreciate it. Group 9 was Austin, Ben, Charles, Dax, Bob Latino, Roz, Sonny, Stephen, Welsh. So any volunteers from breakout room 9? Ben, what do you think?
I'll try my hand. Let's see what happens here. I'll even do video.
There you go.
So I'm trying to remember all the points there. I know I talked about some of the things that were happening here at Darlington Nuclear with our observation and coaching program. Andrew discussed some of the evolutions of their procedures and bringing in the capacity, resiliency capacity into their procedures, and so much of what he's doing is new, and so they have an opportunity to embed that in their new procedures right from the get-go. That's kind of exciting. Roz had a point right off the beginning, but I'm struggling to remember it. Maybe Roz can jump in. Yeah, we did spend some time talking about, at least on my end, talking about ONCs. We have a digital ONC platform where you can put it in through your mobile device in the field, and we're using that as a database, and then trying to trend that information as a potential to gain insight into what's happening in the field. It's not a silver bullet. It's just makes up another point for us to gather insight. And that's been received favorably, and we've had continuous improvements in our safety and performance over the last 2 years since introducing it.
Cool. It sounds like you guys kicked around some good, some best practices and things that are working for you. So nice. Thanks, Ben. And last breakout room was Carrie, Doug, Galen, and Steve. So who wants to give us just a headline or two?
Okay.
All right.
Can you hear me? All right.
Carrie, thank you.
So I was nominated. I don't know how I got that one, but I was nominated.
Well done, you.
Yeah. So we did, just like we've heard others say, we talked a lot about monitoring versus measuring, and the wealth of data that we have coming in from all directions from our organization, and not always knowing what's adding value and what's being measured appropriately, because some of the measures just don't add a lot of value. The other part that stuck out was, don't shorten the education of senior leaders. Sometimes leaders and managers are the biggest barriers that we face in trying to have effective implementation of systems and processes. So don't shorten the education of them, because even very, very educated people, brilliant people, we can't assume that they understand these concepts and philosophies that we're teaching here. And then allowing workers to drive processes and programs. So we learned through chatting that several of us have pretty lengthy histories with behavior-based safety. So that gave us some common ground to discuss the kind of observations and trending there, and then how that ties in with what we're talking about from a human performance and resilience standpoint.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I really appreciate everybody's flexibility with the breakout rooms and how we did that. And it seems like you had a lot of great conversations. And where we're going to go now is to take a break, lunch, dinner, whatever time zone you're in, breakfast. It is 12:42 Eastern. We are going to come back at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. You know, that was intended to be, it is an optional time to join breakout rooms. I will say there's a strong thread in the chat window right now about continuing the collaboration and continuing to connect. I think we have a pretty good mechanism to handle that. Bob had collected email addresses in advance of the conference. We'll probably figure out a way to make that, you know, put a little more structure to that. Robin Waterman, thanks for volunteering, you know, to help move that forward. The breakout rooms that we'll do that are optional at 1:30 Eastern, I think you have a lot to talk about. You know, the things you just shared about learning culture, about monitor versus measure, about, you know, leadership engagement. I think there's a lot of really good, rich stuff there. So thanks everybody for great participation this morning. Thanks for your time. Sorry I ran you 13 minutes over budget in this session. We'll see you back here at 1:30 for the optional breakout rooms and at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time for the next presentation. So thanks. See you in a bit.